I'm thrilled to welcome everybody here on behalf of Veterans for All Voters. As many of you know, but I know we have some new faces joining us too, we're a nonpartisan community of veterans and partners working to make our democracy stronger, fairer, and more representative. We took an oath to defend the Constitution, to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, and we're fighting to strengthen our republic here at home. I do want to very briefly mention Election Day. National headlines are obviously focused on a bunch of other things, but one of the really exciting things for us here at Veterans for All Voters is that there are voters in 14 cities and counties across the country, across 7 different states, casting ballots using ranked choice voting, something that I know so many people within our community have fought hard for over the past 5 years. Some of those cities are doing it for the first time. Fort Collins, Colorado is joining the list of cities using ranked choice voting today. And Greenbelt, Maryland is voting today about whether or not they will adopt RCV. So just really exciting. Want to give a shout out to all of our volunteers and many of our partners for leading the way and pushing for these reforms. And it's a reminder to me that democracy is alive and well at the local level, led by citizens, led by veterans, who believe really deeply that competition and accountability make our government stronger. And that's what we're all about here at Veterans for All Voters. The last thing I'll say, and then I want to turn it over to Eric and then ultimately to David and the governor. Our focus over the past 4 years has been on ranked choice voting and open primaries. And as many of our close partners and volunteers know, this is the first year that we're opening the aperture to a bunch of different election reforms that increase participation, increase representation, make a better system, a fairer system. And one of those things is campaign finance reform, our topic today. It's a key piece of this puzzle. It's an issue that unites Americans across party lines and resonates really deeply with the veteran community that makes up Veterans for All Voters. So to explore that, really excited to have someone who's walked the walk, former Montana Governor Steve Bullock. Before we dive in, I want to hand things over to our founder, Eric Bronner, for a few words.
Thanks so much, Alberto, and thanks, Governor, for being with us today. Just a quick word to say thank you to those of you who are part of the 700 volunteers who've raised your hand to join the movement that Veterans for All Voters is building, or if you're one of our over 7,000 supporters, we thank you. We would not be here without you. Last week, I was in West Virginia and in Pittsburgh meeting with some of our veteran leaders. There's good work happening all around the country, thanks to each and every one of you. And I just want to highlight 2 of our core values that are so important to us that we talk about and we do our best to live every day. One is that we choose to operate above the partisan fray. And in this day and age, it is absolutely a choice. And it's a choice worth making to operate above the partisan fray, to attempt to see the world maybe from a different viewpoint or get your news from a different source, and for us to be bridge builders across partisan divides. And then the second one is that we're playing the long game, and we know we'll be friends when our mission is complete. And we value friendship, and we're playing the long game. So there's this juxtaposition today. It's election day. Elections are super important. Absolutely, people should get out and vote. And we're playing the long game. And we're here today to talk about the long game, structural reforms, systematic changes that can help pull us out of the 2-party doom loop. So really excited for this conversation, and I'll hand it back to Alberto.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Last thing that I'll say here before we get to the governor, but this event would not have been possible if it wasn't for the extraordinary hard work of one of our best of the best volunteers, David Oaklander. I know he's cringing that I'm saying that in the first place. David's an Army veteran, a West Point grad, did multiple tours in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom. And after retiring from the Army, he continued giving back to his communities, first as a teacher, a principal, leader in education, and now in this work with Veterans for All Voters. Lives in Montana and just an incredible volunteer leader. He's the one who helped set up this conversation So wanted to give him a few minutes. David, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Governor, welcome. And Alberto, thank you. Good morning to everyone. And on behalf of Veterans for All Voters, it's an honor to welcome you. Today, we're joined by someone who embodies what it means to serve with humility and courage, former Montana Governor Steve Bullock. Governor Bullock was born in Missoula and raised right here in Helena, Montana, a product of our public school systems. He went on to Claremont McKenna College and Columbia Law, and he never forgot his Montana roots. Before becoming governor, he served as Montana's Attorney General, where he took on one of the toughest fights in American politics, the battle against dark money and corrupt campaign practices. His name appears on the U.S. Supreme Court case, American Tradition Partnership versus Bullock, a case that defended Montana's century-old Corrupt Practices Act. He later signed the Disclosed Act into law, bringing transparency and accountability back into our elections. For Steve, democracy isn't a talking point. It's a sacred trust to be protected. As governor, he expanded Medicaid to tens of thousands, invested in education, strengthened our economy, and kept public lands accessible to those who love them. But beyond titles and policies, what sets Steve apart is his character, a pragmatic public servant, deeply rooted in community. That truth came alive several weeks ago here in Helena when he participated in a community conversation on restoring trust in our political systems at Brothers Tapworks, a bar he co-owns with his brother Bill. It wasn't a political event. It was neighbors sharing stories and ideas over a pint. That gathering is what led him to join us today. It says a lot about who he is, a leader who listens, connects, and believes that democracy, or in many Montana circles, a constitutional republic, is built one conversation at a time. For those of us who wore the uniform, his values should resonate deeply. Veterans understand service, the kind that puts mission before self. Governor Bullock has carried that same spirit into public life, fighting to ensure that every citizen's voice is heard and that the people, not special interests, determine our future. It's my privilege to introduce the former Commander-in-Chief of the Montana National Guard, a champion of transparency and trust, and a humble public servant. Please welcome former Governor Steve Bullock. Governor.
Thanks, David. That was really kind of you for sure. And thank all of you for being on today. And I think what Eric had said, and also reflected by Alberto and David, is that, look, your voice is so important. Like, if you look at this time of great dissension and division across the political spectrum, there's probably only one group that commands universal respect, and that's our service members and our veterans. So I so appreciate you all engaging in these questions and challenges of democracy, because your voice really matters in the overall system. So look forward to our conversation today for sure.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Just went through the attendee list real quick and just wanted to give you a heads up. We have some of our superstar volunteers here on the call today, and we're recording this and we'll be putting it out for the rest of our volunteer community to see. You know, we both mentioned this at the start of this event. Today's election day across the country in a lot of different states. And Eric mentioned that one of our core values is to operate above the partisan fray. There's a lot that's challenging about our country right now, but we work really hard to try to provide an optimistic vision about where we're going as a country. I'd be curious, you know, right now, election day, maybe to kick this off, what are some things that are giving you hope?
You know, look, the engagement, as you noted, Alberto, 14 communities actually saying, is there a better way to have votes? The engagement, continuing engagement amongst challenges of saying that literally our vote is our voice and people are engaged. So the hope out of that is that at some point we can get above some of this partisan fray and say, like, look, why did you sign up for the military? What does adherence to the rule of law mean? What can we do to turn down the temperature, not continue to increase it? And when you look at like public opinion surveys, the vast majority of people just want government to work, right? And how can we positively reinforce that working often means compromise? Working often means getting in rooms with people that you don't always necessarily agree with on everything, but you can find common ground. And how can you as veterans, or how can we as voters and community members actually incentivize that versus making it less attractive to do so?
Thank you, Steve. David gave a wonderful introduction there. You've had this extraordinary career of public service, and you chose public service as a vocation, and we're all really inspired and grateful for that. You're also known as a leader who gets things done, who's willing to build bridges, which is critically important in a place like Montana. Can you give us kind of a reflection of the state of politics in this country, and kind of how we got where we are today?
Yeah, and it's easy to get completely enmeshed in this very moment, right? And I've tried to give thought, Alberto, so I graduated college in the late 80s. And I was inspired to try to get involved in public service or one way or the other. And I try to think of what's changed from then to today, structurally, institutionally, that might have been part of where we are today. And I'll put it in three factors. One of which, when I graduated college in the late 80s, 135 of our 435 congressional districts were viewed competitive. That means plus or 5, minus 5 points, either way. Fast forward to today, that's about 25, maybe 27. And that's even before all this redistricting stuff that's been going on around the country. So that leads candidates to simply try to curry favor more or less with the party activists in the primary, and rather than concerning themselves with trying to appeal to independent voters. And then once elected, right, an increasing number of those elected officials go to our state house or to Congress. And look, they have dogmatic and uncompromising approaches. That the way our districts are drawn really does remove any incentive to find common ground. Second, I think the media landscape has substantially changed since back then. Never forget the first time I met Ted Turner, right? Ted Turner is a big landowner in Montana. And this was a dozen years ago. I said, Ted, I remember when I was in high school and CNN finally came to the point where, look, you could get news all around the clock and from all across the world. And I said, do you ever think you really screwed things up? Because today, really, we're now part of 24-hour news cycle, both broadcast and social media. It's hard to be deliberative when, no matter the time, the consumers or the media demands immediate responses. And more than just the fact that now everything's breaking news, I think there are two other big changes. One of which in the late 80s, the FCC got rid of this thing called the Fairness Doctrine, which had been around since the late 40s. And what that basically said is, no, you don't have to have exactly equal time, but if you have a broadcast media license, you have to present controversial issues at times, and you have to do it in a way that has both voices more or less heard. I'll be darned, right after that repeal, a little radio host in Sacramento named Rush Limbaugh went national. And more than just that, also, along with those sort of changes came social media, right? And social media was the idea that this is finally going to be people talking to people about the candidate, not just the candidate or the elected official talking to people. The promise and opportunity amongst algorithms and other things really has not been realized. So we're increasingly getting our news or our information from inside echo chambers, where the distinctions between facts and opinions have really gone away. And it makes it that much more difficult to have thoughtful political conversation when that's the case. So I think the redistricting, the media landscape, and third and probably most pernicious is the change in the post-Citizens United world of both corporate independent expenditures and dark money, or undisclosed expenditures.
Eva, I really appreciate the point. I'm a huge late night comedy fan, and Jon Stewart has talked a lot about the pernicious nature of the 24-hour media cycle, and I think it's just a brilliant point. Could you talk a little bit more about taking a step back from that? You led as a state attorney general, as the key executive, the commander in chief of the Montana National Guard. Could you talk a little bit more about the other levers of power that are at play here, whether it's the Supreme Court or Congress, the president, how we as veterans and veterans who are involved in political work should be thinking about those different key levers?
Well, I think it is interesting, Alberto, because in some ways, I mean, the two key levers that you point to, right, are both separation of powers, 3 independent branches, an independent judiciary. Look, I've argued a case in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. For a geeky lawyer, like you went to the Super Bowl. I think you need to be thinking about each of those levers and how can you actually support when things go right? Meaning that, look, the power of my state legislature to check me as the executive, be it Democrats or Republicans, is an institutional power that needs to be actually exercised. And I think right now, actually, there are times where you can turn around and say, well, Congress isn't doing its job because Congress has, right, the power of the purse, or it's Congress that makes these determinations. So as an organization above the partisan fray, just the positive reminders that you do have this role. And there is things so much more important than politics. And the rule of law is one. Like the country certainly is founded on the Constitution, but it's also the norms, the expectations that look, I had more than enough times when a federal court judge ruled against me as governor or attorney general. I did not agree with the decision, but I also knew as part of your long game, supporting that decision and supporting that institution, and then seeing how I can ultimately still make change within the confines of what a court might have done is the right way to go, as opposed to trying to essentially destabilize or attack the institutions that we have.
Yeah. As a community of veterans, we very much know how to take orders and follow them out. And so I hear you there. You started touching on this, so I think it's a good sort of transition to talk specifically about Citizens United. And as I mentioned in my intro, campaign finance is a new issue area for us. We're trying to figure out the lay of the land, and we're so appreciative that you're here spending time with us. Could you talk to us a little bit about the ways in which that was groundbreaking? I think we all know anecdotally here, having watched the news. And what do you see as kind of actionable steps right now that we could be taking, that Congress could be taking to increase transparency and accountability in campaign finance laws?
You bet. As you mentioned, I was governor, or I was attorney general, the state's chief legal officer and law enforcement officer before I was governor. And in 2010, this case went up for the U.S. Supreme Court called Citizens United versus the FEC. And at the time, I led an effort where the vast majority of states, Democrats and Republicans, said, if you're going to tinker with our campaign spending process, do it in a manner that ultimately will show restraint in allowing unlimited campaign expenditures. The U.S. Supreme Court ultimately reversed decisions back to the 1970s and said corporations essentially have the same authority and powers as any of us do to spend in our elections. And they grounded it on two premises. One, they asserted that there's always going to be disclosure so citizens can see whether elected officials basically are in the pocket of so-called moneyed interest. Those were the court's words. And also, because that spending is legally independent, the appearance or influence of access will never actually happen. More than just sort of that corporate spending, though, and Alberto, you mentioned this notion of dark money spending. And dark money spending is essentially expenditures where an organization or entity might live out of a post office box in Washington, D.C. They'll call themselves, right, Americans for America, but you never know who's actually writing the check behind that. And look, the first major challenge to Citizens United was brought by Montana. As David said, we had a 100-year history of making sure elections were about people, not about corporations or special interests. And Citizens United threatened that. 5-4 decision, the court overturned our 100 years and said, look, you know, the dissent actually said even our experience after Citizens United showed cast grave doubt on supposition that independent expenditures don't corrupt or appear to. And what we've seen since then, look, there were 2008, before Citizens United, parties and groups spent $168 million in federal races as independent expenditures. Fast forward to 2024, that was $4.4 billion, with $2 billion of it, 1.9 in undisclosed spending. That's either those groups making the direct expenditures or giving to super PACs. And outside money not only impacts campaigns, it impacts then what our elected officials are doing when they come to Washington, D.C., or when they come to state houses. And also then voters' trust in the system, right? When 80% of Americans, that's a Pew report, says that the big moneyed interests have more or less way too much influence, and 70% say my voice doesn't matter. When only 5% of folks in a Pew study say that our members of Congress are worrying about me and my district all of the time or most of the time, it really gives rise to, it's more than just about the elected officials. It's about, does our voice even matter in the system? Now, I think it's easy to turn around and say, nothing you can do, right? The system is so broken that there's nothing you can do. But I think even within the existing system, there are things that we can do. These dark money groups are called 501c4s, right? It's that's a member of the tax, a statute within the tax code that says it's, you know, it's these nonprofit expenditures that can still spend about 50% of their time dealing with policy-related concerns. Like one of the things that we did in Montana that David mentioned, and we passed the Disclose Act. So the Disclose Act said 90 days before an election, no matter what your group is, you have to disclose all contributions and expenditures. And I'll be darned in our state elections if then these dark money groups stayed out of our state elections during the time that it matters. Another thing that we did at the state level is I did an executive order that said, look, I don't care if you spend in our elections, but if you want to contract with the state of Montana, you have to report out all the ways that you're either spending or contributing to influence our elections. Think if the US government, the federal government did that, right? Because they contract with dang near every company in the country. There's a third thing that's happening in Montana right now, which will be interesting, is the premise of Citizens United really is, and corporations are creatures of state law, right? That every state says what a corporation can and can't do, if it has to have board meetings, things like that. So not even talking about necessarily corporations' expenditures in our elections, states can turn around and say, here's what, if you want as a corporation to do business in the state of Delaware, you can't spend in our elections. That's a ballot initiative that's working its way through, so it'll be really interesting. But at the end of the day, like, look, I don't think we're going to immediately overturn Citizens United, but Citizens United was premised. The whole basis of the case was that we, the voters, will know who's writing the checks and trying to influence things. And if elected officials are kind of going to be like NASCAR, you know, sponsored by all kinds of folks with the labels on them, we ought to at least know who's doing the spending. And that is one where, look, Democrats right now are probably, I think in 2024, there were more undisclosed spending for Democrats than Republicans. So this ought to be one area where we can all agree on, is just saying, if you want to spend our elections, we want to know who's writing the check.
Love the image of a politician wearing a suit that just has patches all over them. That's great. You know, I meant to mention this in the beginning for all of our attendees today. Please feel free to drop questions in the chat. I'm monitoring the chat, and we'll work hard to make sure that we're getting those asked as much as we can. Going back to Montana, you know, David Oaklander's been a superstar leading our political reform work there in Montana. We have a great community within Montana. I'm kind of blown away, and I have been since I joined Veterans for All Voters, by the ways in which Montana sort of is the face of what the political reform movement looks like. Could you reflect a little bit on why that is, and what other states might be able to take away from Montana's political reform work?
Yeah, and I'll be honest, Alberto, I think it's being challenged more and more as we become polarized in every corner of this country. Like, look, when I got reelected in 2016, Trump won by 21, I won by 4. A quarter of my voters also voted for Donald Trump. I had made the mistake in 2016 of saying, like, I wish people cared as much about politics and the political processes as they do about professional sports, right? On any given Sunday, you have not only stadiums filled, but you also have millions watching. I think in some ways now people do. Like, oh, you're a Raiders fan. Not only do I not like you, Alberto, I also don't like your siblings. I think Montana's history was rooted in part in why it worked. At one point, if you go back 100 years, like, it was the corporations that controlled everything. We had these copper kings, these wealthy copper magnates. You know, a paper in the early 1900s said the most important issue faces today is whether corporations shall control the people or people shall control the corporations. So we had this history, and then a history of regular Montanans taking it back, saying that elections are about people. We have some of the lowest contribution limits in the country. It's about talking to people. It's not about special interests in corporations. And that was the environment that made it so, yeah, we passed the most progressive, not politically, but in progress of making sure that individuals have the voice, probably the most progressive laws in the country. And my partner on most of that was a Republican coal miner from Eastern Montana, who we didn't agree on everything, but I'll never forget, like, when we were doing this Disclosed Act at a press conference, his name was Dwayne Ankney, he recently passed away. He goes, if I'm going to be gut shot, I at least want to know who's doing the shooting, right? So we've always had a libertarian streak, a libertarians distrusting government, but caring about their neighbors. But then we also had the empowerment of enough people saying, we can disagree on some policy issues, but elections ought to be, and the power making that ought to be with the average citizen, not with either party leaders or special interests.
That's great. We have been really intrigued by this new constitutional amendment that's being moved forward by American Promise, the For Our Freedom Amendment. In part because it's an interesting mechanism from which we could get dark money out of politics, but also just as a form of political participation. Our founding fathers imagined our Constitution to be this living document, and we haven't passed an amendment since 1992. Could you give us just your reflection on this idea of building out a constitutional amendment around money in politics?
Look, I think it's important, to your point, like how difficult it is to get a constitutional amendment passed, right? We went about 100 years with Equal Rights Act and still didn't get that through.
Yeah.
But there are two things that we know for sure. One is giving veterans, giving citizens a stronger voice in our system is something that all across the political spectrum they agree on, right? That the pernicious efforts of undisclosed spending in our elections, when all of a sudden individuals feel like my vote doesn't matter because it's not backed by a huge check, across the political spectrum, voters agree that we should get rid of it. And the second is, ultimately, even if it doesn't end up amending the Constitution, having this as a discussion and getting to one of the things that we need to do, right, is that in Montana, I think I was held daily accountable by my voters. That, like, them saying, like, Bullock, what are you doing here? But making sure that we have those conversation pieces where we can say to our folks that want to serve in the public sector for us, where are you on this? As a driver to organize, even if we don't amend the Constitution, I think it's critical.
Yeah, I love that. It's an exciting idea. It's exciting seeing it gain some momentum, and I think whether or not it's successful, and I do hope it's successful, just a part of, we're 250 years into this American experiment, and it's nice to see something like this moving forward and being considered seriously.
No, that's right. And I'll only also say too that as it's being considered, the other thing where states are the laboratories of democracy.
Yeah.
Look at where some states are doing some innovative things, hold them up, and at times we can influence better, as you've done with ranked choice voting. You can do it better at a state by state or locality by locality, and that's what helps build the national conversation for change.
Yep. That leads perfectly into my next question. This is a moment of increasing polarization, and you touched on the fact that, a large number of your constituents, a large number of your voters voted for the Republican presidential nominee during your reelection efforts. How do you think about this moment of just extreme polarization, growing polarization, and how do we build broad coalitions in this moment?
Yeah, it does really concern me, Alberto. Like, look, never forget when I got elected governor, my kids were 6, 8, and 10, like the youngest in 40 years for moving in the governor's race. It's my first day of the state. I said, you're going to hear a few different sounds from the governor's residence in my office, and that's the sound of kids. And kids learn from our words and our deeds. So let's act like our kids are watching, because they are. So part of this is incumbent on the elected officials, right? And to try to live to that higher standard. Some of those systems, both the money systems and the social media system, may disincentivize that. But it's our job also to hold up those shining examples when people rise above it. I would never punch down, meaning that, look, I had a big megaphone as governor. There could be a legislator trashing me on a daily basis, but what do I gain by trying to minimize them? It only minimizes me. So I think, and I also recognize that half of, be it I'm trying to get Medicaid through or anything else, half of my constituents, if I said the world was up, they would think it's down. So our elected officials ultimately need to make it less about them and more about us. And if it's veterans saying, look, I don't care if you're Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, or Vegetarian, if you're not funding the VA, if you're not providing the services, we expect more. When the voice really does come from folks on the ground, be it with election reform or other issues, like we saw it earlier this year, where there was thoughts about transferring some public lands. It wasn't a special interest group that got that out of the reconciliation. It was individuals that may not agree on everything, but calling their members and making noise to say that these are owned by all of us and they shouldn't be transferred. So we have to find those ways where we can bridge and make unique coalitions with people we may not always agree with on everything, but be willing to agree and say there are some core tenets of this that we can come together on.
Yeah, Steve, it really strikes a chord with me. You know, we have looked at our community here at Veterans for All Voters, and as Eric mentioned, we have over 700 volunteer leaders. We have over 7,000 supporters in all 50 states, and we run the political spectrum. We have traditional progressives, traditional conservatives. We have a whole bunch of people who are in the middle, you know, especially independents or non-affiliated voters, and thinking about how we speak with a unified voice to say that we're not okay with the way things are, and that we have an optimistic view of where we could go with these political reforms. I think it's a really great points, and I appreciate.
And I think, Alberto, that's also how you make durable change, right? We've seen, even in the last, at the federal level, in the last handful of years, it whipsawing from one side to the other. Durable change occurs when you have unlikely allies coming together and saying, I'm putting country above individual policy, or we know these structural reforms, like everyone ought to have a voice in the system. That's how we actually, I think, make durable change, is the work that you guys are doing.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So for the folks on the call, we have a little less than 10 minutes. So if you've got questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Steve, I want to ask, you know, again, I mentioned the things that kind of aren't in the headlines today on election day. One of the things that very much is gerrymandering, which is on the ballot in California, obviously Texas, Illinois, Maryland. A lot of states are considering or moving forward with gerrymandering efforts. How do you think about that as former AG, former governor of a state? How would you recommend we think about this gerrymandering that we're seeing happen today?
Yeah, and my take may not be, you know, look, at the start I said one of the biggest problems we have is that it's no longer competitive. Almost all of the seats in Congress, if you win the primary, you win. And this year it's being much more further exacerbated, right? It started with Texas. It's now in California on election today. I think that one of the challenges for me on this, like, is that this is the year to stand down on the issue, meaning that you can turn around and say, oh, I can't believe what California is doing. You could have a powerful voice in saying that. But what just happened in Texas, or what may happen in Indiana? So hopefully post 2026 or 2028, we pick up the pieces as a country and say, this is not the way it should work. Like, I've had people on both sides of the aisle. I mean, even good, solid Democrats or good, solid Republicans in safe seats that have said, I wish it were otherwise. Yeah. Because then I would be incentivized. I would actually get credit for working across the aisle. And that credit does not exist right now. But when so many norms are being challenged, when so many things are being challenged, My personal opinion is this isn't the year to do it, because if you say gerrymandering's bad, which I agree it is, well, are we feeding into a debate that it's already going to happen for the 26 midterms? So it's almost, to me, let's pick up the pieces after 26 and see how we can get closer to a system that really is based on giving everybody a voice and trying to make sure that we're incentivizing working with people that we disagree with at times, or working across the aisle.
Yeah. We have a couple of excellent questions from the audience. This first one's from Chris Himsel, our volunteer leader in South Carolina. He says that it seems that political parties have usurped the constitutional checks and balances. Are politicians more loyal to their parties than to the institution?
I think that's a fair question. Like, look, I want to go in with the premise of, because people could criticize me every day. Like, I'll never forget the day after I got elected, or the day of, because it took over 24 hours. It was so close, running into someone saying, I didn't vote for you. And, Montana's a small town, basically. I'm like, I knew him. I'm like, Bill, I know you didn't vote for me, but my job now is to represent you and everybody else. You may not always agree, but that's how I will wake up. I think we are in a position where it really is red team, blue team. And what concerns me most, or one of the things that really concerns me about that is, and it may be, as you suggested, Alberto, sort of abdication to the political party. Political parties are supposed to be just us, though, right? Whoever we are. And it really is abdication of the institutional roles that you hold, that if you are a member of the Senate, you have to take that advice and consent for all nominations seriously, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. If you are the power of the purse, the committees. So I'm not sure if it's the political parties that have as much power. To be honest, if you look at the DNC and RNC, the national, they're almost bit players. It's the money that has the most power, and it's often those party leaders that have the most power, demanding strict adherence when that isn't what Americans necessarily want.
Yeah, I had mentioned this a second ago, but our community, a large part of our community are independent or non-affiliated voters. You're seeing more and more people sort of walk away from the two-party duopoly and no longer claim either party. And among veterans, 55% of post 9/11 veterans identify as independents. What do you make of that trend? You're seeing younger people, larger minority populations all moving towards non-affiliated or independent status. What do you think about people moving away from the two parties?
Look, I think that's the vast majority of Americans, right? I mean, most people in this country don't have time to say, oh, am I going to be this policy or this policy, right? They're worried about, is my kid going to get sick? Is my car going to break down? Am I going to have a roof over my head? So the idea that most folks are independent, like they're not either in the typification of what one party is versus the other, because at times, right, it may not even be the party, it's what people are saying about the party. I think that's where most Americans are. And it's figuring out then how to make sure that their voices can be heard in this system, and actually that they have the currency to have their voice heard. Because I think part of the thing of, like, as you mentioned, groups, young people don't believe the government can work anymore. And if I was a young person, I'm not sure that I would blame them for thinking that way. So anything that we can do to incentivize, because I do think the vast majority of Americans are in the middle and just want to make sure that their community, their household, their country is living up to what it could be. Now, we may have different views of what that might look like, but let's try to actually govern to the middle as well.
Brian Schroeder asks an interesting question here that I'll try to convey in as much of a nonpartisan way as I can. I do think as much as we see this unbelievable growth in dark money in politics, and the statistics that you shared were just incredible by an order of magnitude more. Brian points out the facts that those sort of moneyed interests are actually being kind of flaunted today, that there's a moment where billionaires are making it clear that they are giving this money in this political moment. And he asks, does the information identifying political contributions actually matter if billionaires or corporations are standing up and kind of proudly giving money, especially to the executive branch?
Well, I think it still matters because at least then we as voters know who's doing the buying, right? Like I'll even go back before this moment right now when the tax cuts during the first Trump administration were going through, and Senator Graham said, we have to get this through to make our donors happy. Like that is the basis of corruption, or the exact examples of giving money and a billionaire flaunts, here's what I get. That's exactly what Citizens United said will never happen. Yet we're seeing quid pro quo, which is a funny Latin word, right? Corruption in front of our eyes.
Yeah.
And so I do think it matters, but I also think then it matters that we call out collectively when we're seeing this and say, you don't work for them, you work for us. There's a reason why most Americans say that members and even the executive branch doesn't care about my needs, right? And all we can do right now is use our voice on that, or, work through the courts, work through mayors, work through states, and continue to introduce measures at the federal level, even if they're not passing, to make sure that the conversation really ought to be, it's about us, it's not about the billionaires.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. I just have two more questions. I'm going to ask this question from Mike Lehman, and then I'll have a question to close us out, and then just give you an opportunity to say a few last words. So Mike is in Maryland doing great work on that Greenbelt reform issue that we talked about earlier. And he asks, in light of what we've discussed, campaign finance, gerrymandering, tribalism, how do we incentivize moving away from the red team, blue team mentality? Is it through structural reform? Is it magnifying or multiplying movements, like Disagree Better, or both? How do we bring to light those movements? And he says the two parties won't reform themselves.
No, I think that's right, Mike. And for those that don't know, the Disagree Better was the National Governor Association chairman, Spencer Cox, and then who was a Republican, and Jared Polis, who was the vice chair of Colorado, coming out and saying, they did a lot of work on how you have dialogue. I do think, though, that we have to do structural reform. Structural reform is, like, Montana's always had open primaries, meaning you can go, you don't register as a party member. I think that's great. I think ranked choice voting, it's a difficult concept for individuals to understand initially, but we've seen at times doing top four and then going to ranked choice voting. I think structural reform when it comes to money is most important too, is that we have to take those measures. So the only way, it was said at the start by Eric, you guys are in for the long game. And we have to be in for the long game, because calling out where things are good and bad, right, is so important. But also saying how, if we could get above this moment to empower individuals, what do we have to do structurally, and then continue to push on that even when it seems challenging.
Thanks, Steve. So last question here. Maybe a part of our theory of change that we undersell oftentimes is that we want veterans to get involved in these reform efforts, and we want them to build coalitions on the ground, do this grassroots work. We also want people, as they get to better understand our political system, to one day run for office themselves. I'd be interested, given all that we've talked about, all of the ways in which you've expressed a lot of optimism, and I appreciate that. I think we appreciate it as an organization, but there's a lot of pessimism out there too, a lot of cynicism, and a lot of people who come to us and say, I want to run for office, but like, why would I do it right now? Everything is terrible. What words of advice would you give to our community, to the members of our community who are thinking about running for office someday?
Yeah, it is a challenging time. Like, look, I won't sugarcoat that. It is a challenging time to not only run for office, but to serve in office. Like my background, raised in a single parent household, paycheck to paycheck. The only way I knew there was a governor's house is I delivered newspapers to it. So I made it 4 blocks in life from where I was raised. But I will also tell you that what a gift it was. I'm 5 years out of office. Every day was damn hard. But what a gift it was to know that I'm using my skills, my abilities, and my talents, hopefully in furtherance or the betterment of Montanans, even those Montanans that disagreed. And I guess I would counsel 2 things, one of which is that where I started was the veteran's voice is so important. And it is maybe one of the few institutions left right now in 2025 that people actually believe in and care about. And the 2 is, if not you, who? Meaning that if you have a passion about an issue, a passion about service in another way, and you don't stand up, who will? And look, I've lost races. Losing sucks. But unless you're willing to be out there, like you're already doing great work in the communities, but take that risk because your voice in this overall system matters, and the ability to elevate that in a way that goes above sort of the politics of the day also matter.
Well, Steve, it's hard to imagine ending on a better note than that. I really appreciate you being here. Montana is and will remain one of our top priority states, in large part because Dave Oaklander
David's
is
doing
such
great
a
work here for
superstar.
sure.
Yeah. But also it's a place where there's a lot of opportunity, where the citizens really care deeply about their democracy, and we've loved doing work there. One thing I will sort of give a shout out to everybody here who's in attendance. We're building out these veterans caucuses across the country, in every state in the country. We're starting off in Colorado here in January, but we're looking to build them out everywhere. And some states already have small unfunded versions of this. Most of them are partisan in nature. We're looking to build these cross-partisan veterans caucuses. We'll be doing the same, Steve, in Montana. David is going to be leading our efforts there to build that out. Just a place where those trusted voices can get together, be together, and advocate for common sense solutions. And so would welcome everybody who's on the call right now to reach out, think about how we could apply those veterans caucuses within your state, and then think about how all of these incredible lessons that Steve has imparted on us can apply in your states as well. And so I want to give the last word here to David, and then over to you, Steve, to close us out.
Well, thank you, Governor Bullock, for joining us today. I have 5 pages of notes on things that I want to stand up and do better as a representative, as a citizen in our state. So thanks for all the knowledge and the time.
Yeah. How about actually, let me get over to Eric too, make sure you get a chance to say something.
No, it was an outstanding conversation. I also was taking notes, Governor, and just really appreciate all the good work that you've done, your career and lifetime of public service, and for being a champion for transparency and for integrity. So we really appreciate it, and hopefully maybe you'll consider running again someday yourself.
That's kind.
All right, over to you, Steve. Thank you so much.
I'll close with thanking you. And look, tenacity matters. It's funny that David mentioned at the start, I went to this wonderful presentation that he did, and it really was good. And then he emailed me and said, hey, will you do this? And I was traveling or something. So it's probably 3 emails where on the one hand, you could turn around and say, what a jerk, he won't even respond. Or on the other hand, you could say, look, tenacity mattered. I was traveling at this time or that time. And it's not easy in this given climate to say that my actions won't make a difference. It is easy to say that. But your individual actions in your communities, your state, as an organization, does what matter and is what gets us out of sort of the current morass we're in. It's not going to be easy. So I so appreciate folks like David and everybody on this call that are saying, there's this promise of this country that started 250 years ago. And yeah, we've gone through fits and starts, but we can be better. And if we give up that view, we're lost. So keep up the fight and be tenacious in doing so.
Thanks so much, Steve. We really appreciate you are making an impact. Everyone on this call is making an impact, and appreciate everyone being here. And with that, we'll close it out and look forward to seeing everyone in the coming year.